that and they will stay up for a while, I saw. So
Yeah, like till mid-February.
yeah, yeah. So that's nice. Yeah, the timing was just.
Hey, good morning, Mike. Good morning,
Good
Tom.
morning.
Yeah,
Hey, Paul.
now it's 9 o'clock. Let's start.
Okay,
Okay, are you ready?
sure. Yeah.
Okay. Uh, Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Once again, welcome you to this World River and Delta Source to Sink webinar series. So today we invite Professor Torbjörn Törnqvist from Tulane University talk about the sea level rise, the impact of sea level rise to the coastal marshes. So before I introduce Tom, so I was in our last webinar this year is Professor Xu Jinping and from the Southern University of Science and Technology in China. He will talk about the Yellow River sediment from the Burhead to the Yellow Sea. And so that will be the last one of this year. But we have decided to continue. We have more wonderful talks next spring, 2021. And it's unbelievable. We will, enter into 2021. So the first talk we started from Chuck Neutral January 13. So I will send an email before that. We have a bunch of good talks by then. And so Torbjörn is received his PhD degree, physical geography from Utrecht University. And now he is Walker's geology professor in the new department, relatively new, the Earth and Environmental Science at Tulane University, and also the department chair from 2012-2017. Also, 2006 to 13, he served as the director of National Institute for Climatic Changes Research Coastal Center. His research, we all know, he's well known, his publication, his research mainly focused on rivers, deltas, coast, and shallow oceans response to the climate and sea level change. And all, the time is couple hundred years to last LGM. Also other his work research also concerning the coastal subsidence, particularly in a deltic region. So today he will talk about the coastal marsh, how that to respond the sea level change. So Tom, so please go ahead to share your screen and put a presentation mode.
Let me see here. Okay, can everyone see this?
Yeah.
Great,
Good.
thanks, Paul. And you can hear me okay?
Yes.
Let me see if I can get my pointer. Yeah, well, thanks for the introduction. You actually remind me that I have to update my website. I've known this for years now, and who knows, maybe this break is the time. It's what you showed is it's a little embarrassing on my part. It's kind of out of date. But before I go on, I thanks Paul for inviting me, and especially I would like to thank you for this great service you're doing to the Delta community. I can't think of a better way to spend a sabbatical during COVID than what you're doing. I've only recently started watching some talks. The scheduling coincided with my class, so I'm catching up. But I look forward to seeing more of the recorded lectures, and I'm sure many will take advantage of those for hopefully for a long time to come. So on my talk, what I want to do is I want to talk about this kind of basic, but also you could call it existential problem about ultimately the future of our deltas, especially large deltas, in relation to sea level rise. And the way I'm going to get at this problem is to talk specifically about coastal wetlands. And the idea is that deltas that host extensive coastal wetlands, the fate of these wetlands to a large extent determines the fates of these deltas. So I will, for much of the talk, I will zero in on the Mississippi Delta and talk about marshes and how they respond to sea level rise. But before I get there, I'll give some broader context, and then towards the end of the talk, I want to kind of step back and talk a little bit about possible broader implications for deltas elsewhere. Before I do that, I should mention that ultimately I'm going to talk at quite some detail about a study that came out earlier this year that we've worked on for a long time. So I'm listing here the co-authors on this paper, and the one person that I would like to highlight here in particular is Krista Jankowski. This work was a significant part of her dissertation, so she made really major contributions to what I'm going to present. My other co-authors, Frank Lee and Juan Gonzalez, I will give them a shout out later because they will appear on some slides. So let's start off with some context, and I can probably go through this fairly quickly because the first things I'm going to tell you, you all already know, but it's obviously no secret that when we think about large deltas, they are often densely populated. And this is, of course, one way to visualize it. The best examples are, of course, in Southeast Asia, where we have some of the world's largest cities that are often located in these very low-lying environments. So no need to further explain here why worrying about the future of deltas is important. So a really neat study that was done a couple of years ago by Liviu Giosan and a few others is kind of captured in this diagram. And the focus here was on basically, what deltas are going to do considering an X amount of sea level rise, and especially in this case, considering the available sediment to allow these deltas to keep up with future sea level rise. So when we look at this this slide here, we see that many of the large deltas, they're actually plotting in the field where you don't want to be, where you basically have a sediment deficit, right? There's smaller deltas that are still seemingly doing pretty okay. A couple of things to highlight here in this figure is if you look here at the bottom, it talks about 1 meter that has to accrete in 100 years. And that, of course, kind of brings us to sea level rise, which is going to be the primary focus of my presentation. Understanding what sea level rise is going to do in the future is, of course, key, and especially then understanding how these deltas are going to respond to that. The other thing to highlight here is this little comment that the authors made about marshes, and I will be talking extensively about marshes. What I assume they intend here is to highlight the fact that in addition to clastic sediment, which is of course what we're seeing here on the y-axis, that many of these deltas also have the ability to accumulate organic matter in wetland settings that can also contribute to accretion. There is one thing, though, that I think is really important to highlight, and that is that everything we see in plots like this one, it really applies mainly to deltas where reasonably natural accretion processes are still possible, right? So we obviously have, many of these large deltas have been developed to an extent that accretion is very limited, or in many cases not even really possible anymore. And then, you could argue that a lot of these considerations, may not even really apply. So, but of course, there's a lot of deltas out there where accretion is still happening, and where that is basically the lifeline to the future, if you will. So let's talk about sea level rise, and the place to start is probably the best sea level record we have from satellite altimetry that is shown here. Even though this record is of course superior to anything else we have out there when it comes to global mean sea level, the biggest limitation is of course that it's very short. It only starts in the early 1990s. But it's long enough that we have a good sense of the current trend. And according to these various analyses, we have now exceeded 3 millimeters per year. And you could possibly even start arguing that we're starting to see a bit of an acceleration in recent years. But remember that 3 millimeters per year number, because it's going to come back later in the talk. And this, of course, then takes us to the projections for the future. Here is the most recent IPCC report, the special report that came out last year. Of course, next year we're going to get the sixth assessment report, so this will be updated, but this is not going to change dramatically. If we just consider the next, the remainder of this century, we have our, basically n-member scenarios here, the RCP 2.6 and 8.5. And if you look at the upper limit of 8.5, we're looking at about 1 meter of global sea level rise. So now, of course, as we all know, in deltas, conditions are often quite a bit worse because we have to add subsidence to it. So the key question then, as I pointed out before, is this basically very simple question: can deltas keep up with sea level rise today and in the future? And one of the main points I'm going to make is that the answer to this question really depends on the timescale of consideration. If we are just concerned with what's happening right now or in the very near future, the answer might be quite different compared to if we look, to maybe multi-decadal or century timescales. So I'll get to that in a moment. But before I go there, I also want to step back and provide a little bit more kind of historic context to the work I will be discussing. And basically, I'll do that by highlighting two important papers that came out in the 1990s. And one of them, actually the one shown here, is kind of now a staple of the Delta community. So I'm sure this is something most of you are familiar with. The other one that I'll talk about next, maybe a little bit less so. But this is the now famous Stanley and Warren paper from '94 that came out in Science and looked at a good number of relatively large deltas around the world and addressed the basic question: when did these deltas start to form? And the main, let me see here. Why is this not advancing? Okay, there we go. So the data were eventually summarized in this plot here that shows, and this is based on radiocarbon dating of basal deltaic deposits. And what you see is that first we have this large data set for the Nile Delta based on Stanley's work there for many, many years. And you see that there is a clear peak around 7,000 years ago. And they expanded that to world deltas, and they found a histogram that looks very similar to this one. They broke it down in different, regions and settings, but no matter how you slice and dice it, this pattern seems to return. That was an important observation, and they, of course, related this to changes in sea level. And that kind of brings me to this other study that came out in '98, and that's in a very nice way kind of synthesized global sea level data that were corrected for glacial isostatic adjustment and showed based on data from what we call far field sites, so far away from any present or former ice sheets. And they tell a pretty coherent story, and that is that we have very rapid rise until a pretty distinct point, and that is around 7,000 years ago. And then the rise may continue, but it's a lot slower. Now, this was not necessarily something nobody knew before this paper came out, but this was definitely a pretty big step forward in really making that point. And we know exactly why that is, and it's shown here in this animation that is basically based on the most recent deglaciation history, in this case of North America. And if you look in the upper part here, you can actually track the ages. And what you will notice is that the point when the Laurentide ice sheet is basically gone is 7,000 years ago. So now this is, of course, not totally surprising. These things are directly connected. But the important point I'm going to make in this talk, or I hope to make, is that what happens with our deltas is really ultimately dictated by this, because it's very clear that this is the case when we look into the past. I will show that there is a very big difference in how coastal wetlands behave before 7,000 years ago and after 7,000 years ago. And with that, there is, I think there's good reason to believe that that's going to be the case in the future as well. So a lot, basically our deltas and coastal wetlands, of course, what's going to happen with them is going to be determined what's going to happen with the remaining ice sheets. So let's talk a little bit about the Mississippi Delta. This is just an image I shot many years ago, actually the very first time I visited Louisiana. It's the central part of the Delta with extensive coastal marshes dissected by distributaries where people live in small numbers, but people live there. It's an exceedingly low-lying area, and this is a point that I will return to later. The Mississippi Delta is a classic example of a delta with very, very limited elevation capital. Elevations are typically less than, maybe half a meter or so above sea level, at least in these wetlands. The only exceptions, of course, are the natural levees along these distributaries. So why do we care about these wetlands? Well, I'm probably stating the obvious here, but what I sometimes tell my students is that even if you don't care about natural beauty or ethical issues or you name it, these deltas are worth a lot of money. And this is being quantified for, especially for coastal marshes and swamps and mangroves. The goods and services that they provide have a huge dollar amount attached to it. So that means that the motivation to maintain these environments should be really large. But we all know what's happening here. We're losing wetlands at alarming rates. This is just another image from the same flight, but a different location. And it illustrates really nicely what's happening, right? You can literally see that these marshes are drowning. They're subsiding below sea level. We have very high rates of relative sea level rise. And of course, now we have this additional problem of a big shortage of sediment coming in. And that has led to what we see here. And I know that this map is being shown earlier in this series, so I probably don't have to talk much about it. But this is the classic USGS analysis that shows in red all the land that has been lost since the 1930s. So let me, Paul actually asked me to highlight some studies. And when we think about this problem nowadays, I think the natural starting point is what I guess by now is a classic paper by Bloom and Roberts that showed that we have a severe lack of sediment, especially when we consider global sea level rise and subsidence, and that drowning of the Mississippi Delta is inevitable. So, or at least most of the Mississippi Delta, I should probably say. So this was a study that was pretty heavily based on examining the stratigraphic record, so basically long timescales. So interestingly, this summer, another study came out by led by Kelly Sanks at the University of Arkansas that looked at the present day sediment deficit in coastal Louisiana based on observations over the past decade or so. And they came to a much more optimistic conclusion. They found that even though there is a deficit, they found that to be much smaller than what Bloom and Roberts might have suggested. So seemingly there is a conflict here between these two studies. But one of the points I'm going to make here is that I don't actually think there is a conflict. I think both studies are correct, but the difference is really a result of the timescale of observation. And the reason I bring this up is that we have basically made very similar observations when it comes to that more specific question of coastal wetland response to sea level rise. This is a study we published a couple of years ago that I will very briefly talk about. Where Krista analyzed the so-called CRIMS data that people who work around here are probably familiar with. Happy to talk more about that later if there are questions. But the bottom line is these are point observations in very large numbers that allow us to assess whether the wetlands today, and when I say today, I mean the last decade or so, can keep up with the present day rate of relative sea level rise. I'll show some of these findings later. The study basically showed that even though there is certainly trouble, it's maybe not as bad as one might think. In contrast, however, the study that we published this year looks at the stratigraphic record and comes to a much more pessimistic conclusion. And that's a study I will examine in more detail in this talk. So, but before I go there, let's talk briefly about ecology and kind of zoom in a little bit more on marshes, marsh accretion, and what that might mean in the context of sea level rise. So here, another really classic study by Jim Morris and a number of co-authors that looked at the productivity of Spartina alterniflora and demonstrated that there are large differences depending on where you are in the tidal frame. So if you start off at high tide and move to lower elevations, it turns out that productivity increases very significantly until, of course, you hit a point where you start moving to the lower in the intertidal zone or subtidal, and of course then the marshes disappear entirely. So basically you get a curve that looks like this. And I think this is important because this kind of suggests that the system is kind of prone to nonlinear behavior when you accelerate sea level rise. And if you look at this in even more broadly, this is a very important theoretical paper that looks at basically ecosystem response to changes in boundary conditions. And you could envision different scenarios where at the top here we have a fairly linear relationship. So increased forcing leads to kind of an incremental increase in the change of your ecosystem state. In the mid panel here, we have more non-linear relationship where we have more like a threshold type of behavior where we can have a fairly abrupt change in ecosystem state. And then here at the bottom, and this is something that is really highlighted in the paper, is this what you could call a hysteresis effect, where you have these alternative stable states even under similar conditions. So this system can basically flip from, somewhere up here to somewhere down here very abruptly, and may then have a lot of trouble to come back to the original state. In many cases, it may even be impossible. So the point I'm going to make about our marshes is the way they respond to sea level rise is certainly not like this. It is much more like this, and it's plausible, although we can't prove that as of yet, but it's certainly possible that they actually behave like this. They show this very distinct threshold behavior. So I mentioned I was very briefly going to talk about that earlier study based on a modern record. So what you're looking at here, and just focus on the left here because this is the Mississippi Delta, which is the topic of what I'm discussing today. So what you see here is a very simple plot of vertical accretion rate versus rate of relative sea level rise. And what it really comes down to is that you want to be in a green field because that means you have an accretion surplus. Once you make it into the light blue, you have a deficit. Well, it turns out that right now in the Mississippi Delta, about 2/3 of the sites are still doing okay. 1/3 is not doing okay. So now, of course, there's different ways you can look at it. You can, the way I would look at it is like, well, this is a problem, right? This is a way too high number. Of course, you can also say like, hey, most of the sites are still doing okay, so it's not so bad. But maybe the more important point is the one that and this is a literal quote from the discussion section of the paper, and I'll just read it to you. It remains to be seen whether observations for the past 5 to 10 years will translate into longer-term wetland resilience. And, we wrote this in part because we already knew, because that paleo study that I will talk about next was well underway. So we kind of knew where that was going. And we realized that these short records, no matter how valuable they may be, they tell a very incomplete story about what we may expect in the long run. So we're going to dig into the stratigraphic record and examine this problem in a different kind of way. So the very basic question here is, can we take advantage of what you could call this big natural experiment that the Earth has done in the past with very different climates and sea level conditions, and just try to figure out how these ecosystems responded to those conditions. And in this case, we're focused on the early Holocene. So this is the time before 7,000 years ago, when the rate of global sea level rise was much faster than it even is today, but it is within the range of what we expect later in this century. So this is the question here, and the answer to this question is absolutely a yes, because I will show that it's very possible to do this. But I should qualify that a little bit with both some good and some bad news. So the good news is that the paleo record to do this is available in principle, especially in large deltas. Large deltas provide us with this big advantage that we can access early Holocene records while we're still on land. And in most other places, you have to go offshore, and that, of course, makes everything a lot more difficult, just logistically. Now, the bad news is it took us about 25 years to do this analysis. And when I say 25 years, that's how long I've worked in this area. Our analysis is going to be based on data that we partly collected that long ago. Of course, it's only later that we realized that we could address this problem with these stratigraphic data that we collected in the past, often for very different purposes. So the point is, it's these things are not things you do overnight. You can certainly do something a lot faster if you do a more targeted study, but it is a big time investment. So the nice thing about having these longer talks is that I can actually, before I get to the actual study, I can give a little bit more background on how we reconstruct sea level, because it's kind of essential to understand the whole process. So a series of pictures that kind of illustrates how this is done. We do a lot by hand coring. So on the left here, you see a very typical stratigraphic succession where the light gray deposits at the bottom are late Pleistocene. They kind of transition into this dark gray Paleosol, which kind of signifies the initial stages of transgression. And then you have this nice transition into brown marsh peat. And the peat is really what we sample because that provides us with these very accurate sea level indicators. So this is what we call basal peat. It's resting directly on the Pleistocene substrate. And the benefit of that is that it's entirely compaction free. And that means we can rule out compaction, which is a huge contributor to relative sea level rise if we observe relative sea level rise at the land surface. So we kind of bypass that. If you don't do that, you make things exceedingly complicated. So the next step is simply to collect the sample. This is actually Juan Gonzalez, who is about to wrap this sample into aluminum foil. Now, a big part of this kind of field work is surveying. It's actually a huge part. So we've worked with total stations, with GPS systems, just to make sure that we get the elevation of these samples within centimeter accuracy and precision. So the next step is to determine the age of these deposits. So nowadays we use plant macrofossils. Wherever possible, we use, for example, seeds of plants that are almost direct sea level indicators in themselves. This is a very common marsh species, bulrush, that is especially common in brackish to intermediate salinity conditions. And if you have a dozen or so of these seeds, you get a very precise radiocarbon age. So to kind of illustrate the stratigraphy, so what we're looking at here is a typical cross section with our Pleistocene basement here. This is the Paleosol, and the brownish stuff is organic rich. The green to yellowish material are basically clastic overbank deposits from the Mississippi. So these are our samples, and if you look carefully, you can see that the radiocarbon ages, they become progressively younger when you move to higher elevations, right? It doesn't matter which direction you go. So if you collect enough of those samples, you end up with a record that can look like this. So, each of these boxes is what we call a sea level index point. Its size and dimensions is determined by vertical and horizontal errors. What you see here is actually, and this is almost a little bit of a eyeballing exercise, but the point we wanted to make here is that, of course, the rate relative sea level rise initially in this record is quite a bit higher, 3.5 millimeters per year, and then it kind of drops off to lower rates, as you see here. What's suggested here is that there is kind of some break in slope, and guess what? It's right at 7,000 years ago. Now, I'll show you a more complete record later, and this is actually in reality not such an abrupt change. It's relatively smooth, but it is quite noticeable that around this time, the rate of relative sea level rise starts to drop fairly quickly. And that we will see is really important. Well, we have already seen that, because that, of course, corresponds to that time when a lot of deltas started to really form towards what they look like today across the world. All right, so basically that record that we had was a nice start, but we really wanted to extend it both towards the present and especially pushing it further back in time. And that is where Frank Lee came into the picture. This was part of his, well, this was his postdoc project when he was here, which is already more than 10 years ago. But in order to go further back in time, we had to drill a lot deeper. And so we switched to using a geoprobe. Here Frank is collecting one of his cores. And to kind of illustrate a little bit what this looks like, this is an example of one of these cores. So here we have a marsh peat. The Pleistocene is not very far below here. It's not shown here in this particular core. But what you do see here is this very abrupt change to a mud that includes these shell remains. So the way to interpret this and to basically relate it to modern depositional environments is that the marsh peat basically corresponds to, the kinds of peat forming wetlands that we see here. And the mud corresponds to this lagoonal deposit, this open water environment. And this is going to be really crucial because the following analysis is going to be very heavily based on these types of transitions, and especially on the question whether these lagoonal muds are present or not in the stratigraphic record. So back to Frank's study, this was basically the main data set that he produced. This has a lot of detail, don't worry about it. The point is not to examine this in all its specifics, but what you see here is that we're looking at much greater depths, right? The previous record that I showed stopped around 10 meters below present sea level. Here we're looking at 15 to 16. So the basal deposits are the Pleistocene with this paleosol, and then we have very, very thin basal marsh peats in this part of the record that are overlain by these lagoonal muds that are shown here in light blue. So Frank dated all these basal peats, and if you look at all the numbers, you can kind of see the same thing, that ages get progressively younger when you move up section. But this is a time when the rate of relative sea level rise was very rapid, so age differences are actually not that large. So that kind of brings us to the analysis we've done in past years, where we've tried to kind of pull together all this information. And we basically used a large database of sediment cores that all reach the Pleistocene basement and cover this key transition from the Pleistocene into basal Holocene deposits. So here you see everything. It's about 350 data points. We're looking at two large study areas. So one is kind of the western part of the delta. The area where Frank worked is right here, where the Pleistocene is relatively deep. That earlier record I showed is from the eastern part of the delta. It's right here. And what's important to note is that all these sites are pretty far apart. These different smaller study areas that you can identify, they're tens of kilometers across or apart. So we're really lumping together observations from large portions of the Mississippi Delta. And so I'm going to show you first our current relative sea level record for this whole area, because the one thing that we found was that wherever you are within the delta, the sea level history is almost exactly the same. So that allows us to lump data from the western part of the delta together with data from the eastern part of the delta. There is very little in the way of differential crustal motions. So you can see that the initial record that I talked about earlier has now been greatly expanded. We have a very nice, very recent record, thanks to the dissertation from Juan Gonzalez. And then, as I mentioned, Frank added this portion of the record, which has been absolutely crucial for the analysis that we'll follow. So what you see here is not just the actual data. These are what we call sea level index points, right? The little green symbols with error bars. But in addition, you see these little black symbols that form this nice curve. This is basically our best fit curve through this data set. And it's, the parameters and everything is shown here. We have, well, unsurprisingly, perhaps a very nice R square. But the beauty of this is that based on that curve, we can actually calculate for each of those sites where we don't have direct radiocarbon dating, we can still make a very reasonable estimate of the age of the base of the Holocene. And that basically allows us to really greatly expand our data set from just those 72 sea level index points that are shown by the symbols. We can add almost 300 additional observations. So that makes this a really powerful data set. So the solid black line here is basically the first derivative of this curve, and that gives us the rate of relative sea level rise in this area as a function of time. So you can see that in the early Holocene, we were looking at rates that approached a centimeter per year, then dropped fairly rapidly into the present. And when I say present, I mean pre-industrial, right? So the modern acceleration of sea level is, of course, not part of this record here, when we dropped to rates that were well below a millimeter per year. So the nice thing about this is that we basically captured that full range of rates that we can expect later in this century. And remember, right now we're sitting at a little bit over 3 millimeters per year, if you think about the global sea level record. Okay, so let's look at some examples. One day, years ago, we thought about, wouldn't it be cool to make a plot like this with all 350 logs? Would be a lot of work. We never got around to doing that. We instead made a selection. We picked 15 representative sites. And what you see here is a legend with a lot of information. Again, don't worry too much about specifics. Focus on this, the lagoonal mud. That's really the story. One thing to clarify, we have this paleosol, which is basically our 0 point. So what we've done here is we have kind of rearranged all these cores so they all line up. They're basically all normalized to the position of the top of that paleosol. In reality, of course, these older cores that are right here are sitting much deeper than the younger cores. But this is a much more convenient way to kind of visualize what's going on. So at the base, you can see the ages in kiloyears before present. So you can see the oldest site here is almost 8,500 years old, and it goes all the way to maybe 1,000 years old. This is the corresponding rate, of relative sea level rise, which, as I showed, we know for all of these sites. You can see that it increases quite a lot, especially when you go to this oldest part of the record. Okay, so it turns out when you look at the stratigraphy, there are some really distinct differences. And this is kind of how you can break it down. So what we separate out here are, on the left, we have what we call fully terrestrial conditions. So these are sedimentary successions that they vary a lot. Some are more organic, some are more clastic, but what they have in common is that they always remain terrestrial all the way to the top, right? Note that here you only see the first couple of meters, right? Many of these cores extend many more meters, but we obviously examined all of that and found that there is no evidence at all for anything open water lagoonal in this set of cores. When you move to this section here, we start seeing these lagoonal deposits start to show up. Initially, we always start off with marsh, occasionally swamp, but nearly always marsh, usually peat, but not necessarily. And then we have that transition into these shell-bearing lagoonal muds. They're very easy to recognize, and that was kind of also key to being able to do this analysis. What you see, though, is that those basal terrestrial deposits, they are still fairly thick. They are, at least typically 0.5 meter in thickness, sometimes even more. When you go to the earliest part of the record, you see something quite different. You basically see a very ultra thin basal marsh deposit, and then boom, it drowns and turns lagoonal, and the lagoonal deposits also often persist for a very long time. So that is basically what led us to separate between what we call gradual drowning and rapid drowning. So the important thing is, under what conditions does that happen? Well, it turns out that when you exceed 3 millimeters per year of sea level rise, you move into this gradual drowning scenario. And when you exceed 6 to 9 millimeters per year, you move into this very rapid drowning. So during the earliest portion of the record, we were looking at conditions that were really, really different from what we have seen in more recent times. And kind of a nice way to illustrate that, and this is what you could call a space for time substitution, is to, if you take this kind of oblique view of the Mississippi Delta, what we see here in the foreground are still very extensive marshes. This is actually an area where marshes are still doing reasonably okay. Not coincidental, this is also very close to the mouth of the Atchafalaya River. So this is basically a proximal setting. And recent studies have shown that this area is still hanging in there reasonably okay compared to most of the rest of the Delta. Now, if you move to an area like this one, this is the north shore of Lake Pontchartrain, which is a very distal position relative to sediment sources. If we look at the detail here, what we see here is we still have marsh, but this is what we would call fringing marsh that is relatively narrow in width. It's maybe a few kilometers. This is a pretty good way to picture what early Holocene marshes in this area looked like. So the marshes never disappeared. They just transgressed very, very rapidly. And they had a very small footprint compared to everything that happened later on. So one thing we did in this study, we were able to also estimate how long these early Holocene marshes, these fringing marshes, stuck around before they drowned. And we found that it was on average something like 50 years. So, that's obviously a very, very short time scale. So let's get to what's really the key diagram here, and now taking advantage of the full data set. So as I mentioned, we have about 350 observations in total. They're pretty evenly spread through time within this record. And as a result, we capture a wide range of rates of relative sea level rise, right? So we basically classified each observation in terms of what that rate is. And what we see then is that when rates are lower than 2 millimeters per year, everything remains fully terrestrial. And it's only when you go to higher rates that we start seeing these drowned conditions. But the big jump really happens right here. When you exceed 3 millimeters per year, it really jumps up to well over 80% of the total number of sites. So what that means is, of course, this was kind of a disturbing result, because if we relate that back to where we are right now with global mean sea level, we already have exceeded 3 millimeters per year, and we know that we're going to ramp up to higher rates. Now, how high, that's still to be determined, of course. That's going to depend on ourselves to a large extent as a world community. But the bottom line is that the stratigraphic record in this area shows that it's basically inevitable that drowning of these remaining marshes is going to happen. Now, the only silver lining is that the rate of drowning can be very slow. And one thing our work has shown is that if you stay at this roughly 3 millimeter per year rate, it can easily be a few centuries, but it will happen eventually. And this is really hitting home that issue about timescale, right? Because this is obviously something we cannot observe with an instrumental record. Now, that then, of course, brings us, I should look at the time here. Okay. So I'll take a few more minutes to kind of step back and talk about this in a broader context, because, of course, you could ask the question, maybe coastal wetlands in the Mississippi Delta are just more vulnerable than in most other places. And some of that is probably true, and that relates, again, to that issue I mentioned earlier about elevation capital. We are without a doubt, in one of the most vulnerable settings compared to many other deltas. However, there is reason to believe that our findings have broader significance. And because when we did this work, of course, the question was always out there: does this apply elsewhere? And it turns out, and this is kind of funny how these things sometimes go, we didn't have to wait any longer than 2 weeks after our paper came out. And this paper came out in Science that looked at mangroves and thresholds of mangrove survival under rapid sea level rise. So I'll summarize some of the key findings in the study that looked at mangroves in many parts of the world, and basically tried to figure out when mangroves formed and how rapidly they were able to accrete, and to what extent they were able to basically track sea level rise. So they kind of broke it down between far field sites that are really far away from ice sheets. On the upper right, we have intermediate field sites, which are mostly in the Caribbean. The point here is that we start seeing something kind of strikingly similar in some ways to what we found in the Mississippi Delta. So this is the rate of relative sea level rise that was determined from GIA modeling, and then averaged for a large number of sites. So you have higher rates, of course, in the early Holocene. Again, you can see how it drops off around 7,000 years ago. The important thing to look at here is mangrove accretion and when that kicks in. And you can see that it only starts at a certain point in time. If you go further back, you just don't see it. And the reason for that is that mangroves simply were not able to keep up. In these intermediate field sites, we basically see the same thing. So if you pull all the data together, and if we just follow this blue curve, this is kind of a cumulative probability curve, it turns out that you reach about a 10% probability that mangroves can really keep up with sea level rise when the rate drops to something like 6 millimeters per year. And then beyond that, the odds improve pretty rapidly. So this led these authors to the conclusion that something like 6 millimeters per year, if you go over that, mangroves are going to be in very, very deep trouble. So to kind of pull that together a little bit, we've kind of exchanged notes on this issue. And so here again, this is just an image here from the Mississippi Delta, where you see swamps that are dying, being replaced by fresh marsh and eventually open water. Here we have our mangroves, and if you look, not our mangroves, these are mangroves in Australia, but basically we kind of have an emerging picture from these various studies that when the global rate of sea level rise exceeds 7 millimeters per year, marshes and mangroves will be unlikely to survive, at least in their present locations. as I said earlier, they may not disappear entirely, but they will have to migrate rapidly and lose a lot of area. So that 7 millimeter per year number, of course, is what we would consider that rapid drowning threshold, where you talk about rapid changes that could happen within decadal, multi-decadal timescales. So I'm starting to wrap this up here. This is a really interesting and incredibly important study that came out a few years ago led by Peter Clark at Oregon State, that really looks at sea level rise in the future, but really takes the long view. And maybe not surprisingly, it's based heavily on the paleo record. So here you see the global sea level curve all the way back to the LGM, right? And with a lot of the features we have already talked about. And then it looks into the future and considers a number of scenarios. These are basically carbon scenarios. These are numbers or petagrams of carbon that would eventually be released, burned. And depending on the number, of course, we could follow very different scenarios. So let's have a look at what the world might look like according to this in the year 2500. I think that's probably a little more relevant to us than looking at 10,000 years into the future. So the difference between the low and the high end scenario is very large. In the low scenario, we're looking at 3 meters of sea level rise, which is of course still highly problematic, but still it's a lot better than 12 meters of sea level rise that we would see in the high scenario. Now, perhaps more important for everything I've discussed is this curve here that shows the rate of sea level rise. And the low scenario predicts that we're going to basically stabilize at something like 5 millimeters per year, and that's going to stick for about 2,000 years, and then it's very, very slowly going to drop back. Now, 5 millimeters per year, it may not be enough to save the marshes in the Mississippi Delta, but it may be enough to certainly prevent very rapid drowning, which in itself would already be a big benefit. And it might also be enough to save other deltas that are more resilient, that, for example, have more elevation capital. So these are all things to consider. So I'm just going to finish off here with one more picture, because some of you may think like, well, we've heard a lot about sea level, but how about sediment? And it's true, I haven't talked a whole lot about sediment. One thing that I really have to stress, though, is that the type of analysis we do, looking at the paleo record, that of course everything that happens with sediment is baked into the analysis, right? We're basically looking at the end result of the interplay between sea level rise and sediment supply. But when we look into the future, then of course the story about sediment is also concerning. We kind of expect that sediment supply could drop further from things that already have happened because of additional damming. Well, we've heard a lot about that in this lecture series as recently as last Wednesday when Paul talked about the Irrawaddy. So there are many ways to look at this problem. One way is the work that Jaap Nienhuis led that came out earlier this year. This is one of his triangles looking at river wave and tide-dominated deltas. What's shown here specifically is the change from pristine to disturbed sediment discharges coming down the rivers. And the interesting thing is that, if you look at the big picture, is we see a lot of downward pointing arrows, right? And that means that, there is a lot of change happening today where, we're moving away from river dominance to tide or wave dominance. Now, this is not exclusive because we also see errors that point in the opposite direction, right? So this is not a simple problem. To just illustrate that this problem is not simple, one thing Jaap found was that on average, deltas are still growing, despite the sea level rise that we are having, that we've seen over the past 30 years, the time period that he considered in his analysis. But in the future, it's quite plausible that that's going to change. You know, some of it also simply has to do with slow response times. So this is, of course, a very important part of the picture when we look at what we can expect in the future. So let me wrap up with some main conclusions and go back to that key question: will our deltas actually make it? Well, of course, the first point I want to make is that I think the paleo record can really offer very important constraints for these predictions of future delta resilience, especially if we consider longer timescales. One thing I haven't really mentioned, but we really should not forget, is when we look at the paleo record, we have to be aware of the fact that we are, by definition, looking at pristine deltas, you know, and the early Holocene Mississippi was, of course, very much, you know, untouched by humans. That means that whatever we find, we have to factor in when we look at the future, because, you know, our current deltas are, of course, in many cases severely wounded by human actions. So their resilience is probably lower than what it was in the past. So for anyone who would want to take anything optimistic out of what I talked about, I guess you're not going to get it from me. So Mississippi Delta marshes, they drown in a few centuries when the rate of relative sea level rise exceeds 3 millimeters per year. And when you go up to 6 to 9, it's more like half a century. It's probably one of the most vulnerable in a global context. And again, this is due to the lack of elevation capital. So really, this is due to the low tidal range, right? Because that's basically what sets those mean elevations of the delta plain. And just to make the point once again, timescale is really everything. Short-term changes, they certainly tell us something relevant, but they don't really necessarily offer a lot of insights in these really long-term trajectories. So with that, I'm happy to answer questions.
Oh, thank you, Tor, very much for this fantastic talk, and particularly thank you for giving us this magic number, 3 millimeters per year. That's, you know, that's very, very interesting. And so we see the rapid drawing of the coastal marshes over this reach. And so if for the audience, if you have any question, please, you can unmute yourself and go ahead to ask. Okay, yep, go ahead. Can you unmute yourself? Yeah.
Yes, I think I'm
Yeah.
here. Yes, I think so.
Good to see you.
No, I'm not sure why.
Yeah, go ahead.
I hear you fine.
So Tor, this is really fascinating. Thank you. I had a question about your paleo record, and in particular the question of rates versus cumulative sea level rise. And if you look at the late Holocene, of course, they've all had the same, or what you're showing kind of comes down to a very similar history in terms of rates, and therefore also a cumulative history. Did you find any differences between portions that had Holocene high stand versus perhaps the Arctic, where the increase was a little later in sea level rise?
Let me make sure I understand, because when you talk about the Arctic, are you, because, you know, all the sea level history I discussed is entirely based on data from the Mississippi Delta, our own data.
Yes.
So, and
no,
you know,
of course. but of course, if you're making the global, if you make then global claims about marshes or mangroves elsewhere, in particular with the mangrove paper that you talked about, I was wondering if you can comment on the notion that these paleo records have had a very similar history that might be different from the future in terms of the
Yeah.
they've had.
Well, yeah, maybe the issue that might be a bit confusing is that I maybe somewhat casually jumped back and forth between global records and local records. And the one thing that I think is really key is that this type of analysis, it has to be based on local records, right? It's so in our case, well, that happened kind of by definition because a lot of the the initial course where we looked at this marsh evolution and this question of whether they drown or not were the very same course that we used to reconstruct sea level. In the case of the mangrove study, it was kind of a mix where they had a lot of these mangrove records that were radiocarbon dated, so they had a lot of direct information on that. In their case, they used a GIA model, but that GIA model is very well calibrated for those regions. Mm-hmm. So they have a lot of confidence that it produces pretty accurate predictions. It's based on Nicole Kahn's work, was synthesized a lot of sea level data from all these different regions. Mm. Now, in their case, what's also true is that the majority of their sites are in these far field settings where the sea level history is reasonably comparable to the global history, although not exactly, that's for sure. That's why you absolutely need to invoke this GIA model to get it right, because you also mentioned high stands, and it's true in certainly in Australia, for example, there is a very pronounced sea level high stand that has to be fully taken into account. So I don't know, does that answer your question? Or
partly, but yes. No, go ahead if there are other questions.
We can I'm happy to, we'll talk more.
Yes, definitely. Thank you.
Michael, you have a question?
Yeah, so one thing that's always struck me about the work of how well it fits together when you take care of the compaction of the Holocene sediments, but if there's any compaction of subsidence happening below your basal peats, that's not included. And so the question is, how large is that? It's probably limited because the Mississippi Delta is overpressured, and so there's a lot of material that's not compacting due to the overpressure.
Yeah.
So I wonder, for instance, your sea level curve, if you compare that to, say, the GIA predictions of sea level rise, do you see some differences appearing that might be due to compaction, or whether you see any spatial differences? I mean, what you seem to show is everywhere looks the same, and you don't see spatial differences. Now, some of that may be that your distribution, works out well.
Yeah, that's a good question, Mike. And we actually have a fair amount of information on these issues. So, because this has always been a concern when we started doing this work, the one thing that always surprised me was that I fully expected that we were going to see much more in the way of differential motions in different portions of the delta, primarily because of faults and stuff like that. Yeah. But we never found it. And so I'm not saying it doesn't exist at all, but it's it's very minor, at least over these timescales, like the last 8,000 years or so. Now, as far as deeper compaction goes, of course, and I probably I may have overstated things a little bit by saying like it's compaction free. Of course, that's never really true because compaction never totally stops. But we have very strong evidence that it reduces down by orders of magnitude, and part of it is just if you examine the actual deposits, they are over consolidated, and the other way to look at it is simply the data, because if it was a real factor, it would be almost certain that it would be spatially variable,
Right.
and we would have much more scatter in our record, and we don't. It's just remarkably consistent. The one factor that is a real factor, and that relates to the GIA modeling that you mentioned, is what we call basically sediment isostatic adjustment. So basically the effect of sediment loading in the wider area, which that is a real factor. And you know that you know you've been involved in similar work in Bangladesh. It's you know, I think we have pretty good constraints on how big it is. You know, it's big enough that it should be taken into account if you want to convert a sea level record like ours into a global record or something like that. You would have to account for that, but it's pretty small. It's on the order of you know, I would say a couple tenths of millimeters per year. So it's smaller than the typical GIA rate, which in this area is, you know, probably close to a millimeter per year, somewhere between 0.5 and 1 millimeter per year. So it's we have pretty good. You know, when you say can you use GIA models to, you know, figure out the role of these other effects, that's it's always a little bit tricky, right? Because you know, we usually use these relative sea level data to test our GIA models and to constrain them. So what we've done is, and there is a study I'm happy to pass on to you if you haven't seen it, a paper done by Ryan Love, who worked with Glenn Milne a couple of years ago. He did an incredible study, really, where he looked at, you know, data model comparisons for the entire Atlantic coast and Gulf Coast, and what we did for our records from the Mississippi Delta, we made a small correction to them to basically remove that sediment loading effect.
Okay.
And the data model comparison works really, really well. So I think we're pretty confident that it's very GIA dominated, because, you know, one way to think about it is 7,000 years ago, we're sitting at 7 meters below present sea level. And whereas globally, we're pretty close to, you know, where we are now. So there was still a lot of GIA-driven subsidence that happened, you know, throughout the entire Gulf Coast.
Yeah. So, Tor, this is back to the traditional controversial question about the middle Holocene high stand. So we know all the far-field site, they show that kind of a little bit 2 or 3 meters higher than today, like the South Asia, like our friend Ben Hart, what they did in Malaysia, Singapore, and even Australia, South America, or Mediterranean Sea. So here, as your data indicate, we still have a couple meters below the present sea level. There could be a local thing, because in the Middle Atlantic, we're still experiencing this post-glacial kind of a rebound, thinking, kind of, you know, not really, the kind of still thinking based on GIA, just like Mark mentioned. So in Mississippi River, how do you explain, you know, the 7,000 years we still have, you know, couple meters below the present sea level? What's the main cause of that?
Well, you know, my take on this would be that this this sea level high stand issue, at least in this part of the world, I don't think is that controversial. I think there is a large consensus that there was no high stand. There is a pretty overwhelming amount of information, and again, I would refer to that recent paper by Ryan Love, which pulls together sea level data from all the way from Atlantic Canada down to South Texas, and it's a pretty overwhelming amount of evidence that sea level was always below present sea level during the Holocene in this entire region, and in fact, this extends far beyond just the United States. If you look at another really good study to look at is another paper by Nicole Kahn, where she pulled together all the sea level data from the Caribbean and basically showed that the GIA affects subsidence, peripheral bulge subsidence basically extends through most of the Caribbean, and you really have to make it into South America to really get out of it. So I think that's pretty well established by now. I also know that there are really intriguing studies that have pointed to emergent landforms that suggest a mid-Holocene high stand here in the U.S. It's there's certainly work left to be done to understand how these things could form. I'm talking about beach ridges that are pretty widespread in some areas and that are higher than present sea level and are suggestive of sea level high stands in the past. I think we have to look for alternative explanations.
Sure. I agree. Overall, the east coast of the U.S., all the way from Canada, even to the Gulf, is kind of still, we didn't see any that kind of mid-Holocene high stand evidence, because overall still a little bit sinking at 1 to 2 millimeters per year. I mean, after the post-glacial, that could be explained, but I don't know. Other thing is you mentioned about because the marsh, the survival, the maintenance also need sediment. If, as you indicate, if sediment discharge, sediment load is decreasing in the last 50 or 60 years, that could also trigger the problem. You do not need a 3 millimeters per year sea level rise to have a rapid drowning of your could be 2. I mean less. I mean, if
well, the one thing, and I can tell you, and this is always kind of fun to say, especially afterwards, but we had a hell of a time to get this work published. I mean, it was. I think we ended up going through 7 rounds of review with 3 different journals, and the one thing that's came back a lot was partly, of course, the sediment story, and for good reasons, of course, because sure, that is key to everything as well. But the other thing that's kept coming back, and it kind of mystified me a little bit, because we've always been very cautious to not present this as like, okay, it's 3 millimeters per year, that's it. That's it for this particular area, and it's regionally variable. Ben Horton published a study a couple of years ago about the UK that took a somewhat similar approach and found in the UK it's more like 7 millimeters per year and that makes sense because most of the UK is meso macrotidal. It's a very different setting. So we've always been very clear, and for anyone who reads the paper carefully will notice, like, no, we're not ever stating like this is the one thing we are stating, and that I think is really important, is that there seems to be a tendency that if you go from short timescale observations, to these long timescale observations, that you get a very different message. And that's why I used that example earlier where I compared the Bloom and Roberts paper to the recent paper by John Shaw's group. That, you know, that recent paper suggests something more optimistic, but it also looks at a very short time scale. So I think their observations are fine, but we cannot just extrapolate them into the future
Exactly.
without any issues. And
Oh.
so I think that I pretty firmly believe is a widespread phenomenon. Wherever you go, you're going to have this disparity between the time scale of observation, but the actual rates and the actual thresholds, they will vary significantly from one place to another.
Sure. So anybody else? Any question?
Say,
Oh, Steve, yes.
like your 3 millimeters a year from the history is, basically has baked in the sediment supply of the Mississippi River Delta.
Yeah.
And so now where that's, half of what it was, that number is probably different for the future.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's a good point, Mike. And here's the thing: we don't really know what the sediment supply was during the early Holocene. And I only, if there's one, if I can offer one glimmer of hope, we tend to focus a lot on, we've lost half of our sediment, but we always do that with our reference point is the early observations from maybe 100 years ago, when, in my view, the sediment flux was probably a lot higher than what normally was during, pristine conditions, because, agriculture had already really transformed the Midwest. Erosion rates were, I don't think 100 years ago they were really far along with soil conservation practice and stuff like that. So, I think the jury is out on that, and this is unfortunately a very difficult question to answer.
Yeah.
Anyone who can figure out a method to quantify sediment flux rates in geologic history should probably get the Nobel Prize in geology.
Okay, Steven, go ahead.
Hi, Tor. Thanks for your talk. I wondered, you showed with the 3 millimeters per year that marsh converts to water within a certain time. Does that mean there's a net land change? Or can it be transgression at one location and a progradation at another location?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. So it is a net land change, and because the way we try to do our analysis, and this is why it's so important to have a lot of observations that are kind of scattered across large parts of the delta, because if you don't do that, then you definitely run the risk that you start looking at some autogenic phenomenon that you just happen to look at the portion of the delta that was retreating because you had a big lobe switch to the opposite side. So the one thing, actually, I can do this real quick because I have a backup slide.
Good.
I rarely use my backup slides, but now I'm going to do it. So this was actually thanks to the reviewers. They told us to address this issue by breaking down the data set in different portions. And that was actually a really good suggestion, because what you see here at the top, you see these two plots similar to the one I showed before, but this is I guess this is the western part of the delta, and this is the eastern part of the delta.
Nice.
And you see exactly the same thing.
Very good.
This was another question that came up, was like, well, what you're finding is, what happens if your marshes are thicker, because, you're looking at all these flimsy little marshes and, yeah, they all drown, big deal. So we're like, okay, let's do that. And so we only selected the sites where that basal marsh deposit was at least 50 centimeters thick. And, keep in mind, anything that is now 50 centimeters was originally probably 3 times thicker, right? So those were marshes that stuck around for a pretty long time. But, well, you see it here. It basically shows, it still shows more, essentially the same thing. So, so yeah, we're really confident that the results is very robust. But yeah, your question is definitely important.
Very good. Very, very good. Oh, okay, if no any other questions, I think we must stop here. You know, it's great. I think it's very, very informative. Thank you, Tor, very much. And if okay, maybe you can modify your presentation, share some of this, you know, your present to this community, particularly to this young